The gun was already cocked when Nellie Sutton looked into the eyes of the man she thought she knew. Matthew Whitfield stood in the doorway of the Dusty Creek Sheriff's office, his broad shoulders blocking the amber light of the dying sun, his jaw set like iron and his gray eyes filled with something she could not name. Not anger, not hatred, something far worse, something that looked terrifyingly close to grief. "Tell me it isn't true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, though her hand was steady on the pistol she had borrowed from the wall rack not 30 seconds ago. "Tell me you didn't know who my father was when you first rode into Caldwell County." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Nellie had ever heard. Matthew did not reach for his own weapon. He did not step back. He stood perfectly still in that doorway, and the fact that he wasn't denying it hit her like a fist to the chest. "Put the gun down, Nellie. Answer the question. I'm asking you to put it down first." Her finger tightened. Somewhere behind her, a clock ticked on the wall. Outside, the main street of Dusty Creek was settling into its evening rhythm. Horses being led to the livery, children being called in for supper, the world proceeding as though everything was fine, as though the woman she had been 3 months ago still existed somewhere and hadn't been quietly dismantled piece by the man standing in front of her. "You came here looking for him," she said. The words tasted like ash. "You came here looking for my father, and I was just the path you walked to find him." Matthew took one step forward, slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he is trying very hard not to startle something wounded. "That is not the whole truth," he said quietly. "Then tell me the whole truth, right now, before I make a decision I cannot take back." And it was the way he exhaled, long and slow and exhausted, the way a man breathes when he has been carrying something impossibly heavy for an impossibly long time and has finally decided to set it down, that made Nellie's hand tremble for the first time. She needed to know how they had arrived here. She needed to understand the full shape of the thing that was breaking her heart. And so she let her mind travel backward, 3 months and 2 weeks, to the morning a stranger rode into Caldwell County on a black horse with a federal marshal's badge pinned to his chest and sorrow written into every line of his face. The summer of 1882 had been brutal in the Kansas plains. 3 straight weeks without rain had turned the grasslands the color of old straw, and the cattle on the Sutton ranch were restless in a way that made the ranch hands nervous. Nellie Sutton had been up since before dawn that morning, the way she had been up before dawn every morning for the past 2 years, ever since her mother passed and her father's drinking had quietly moved from a weekly indulgence to a daily occupation. She was 24 years old, and she felt considerably older. She was mending fence line on the eastern pasture when she heard the hoofbeats. She straightened, pushing a strand of dark auburn hair back from her face, and shaded her eyes against the morning glare. The rider came from the north road, unhurried, the black horse moving with the kind of easy confidence that told you the animal was well cared for. The man in the saddle sat tall but not stiffly. He wore a dark coat despite the heat, and as he drew closer, Nellie could see that he was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair and a face that was handsome in an unfinished way, like something that had been through weather and come out the other side more interesting than it started. He pulled up at the fence line without invitation, which immediately annoyed her. "This is Sutton land," she said, not particularly warmly. "I know it," he said. "I'm looking for Gerald Sutton. I understand he's the man who owns it." "My father," she said, "and he doesn't take visitors before noon these days." Something moved across the stranger's face, a flicker of something she couldn't read. "I see. My name is Matthew Whitfield. I'm a deputy United States Marshal out of Wichita. I have some business with your father that won't wait on his schedule, I'm afraid." Nellie studied him for a moment. She was not in the habit of trusting men on first acquaintance, and she was particularly not in the habit of trusting federal lawmen, who in her experience tended to show up only when someone was in serious trouble, or when the government had decided it wanted something that belonged to someone else. But there was something in the way Matthew Whitfield looked at her, direct and steady without being aggressive, that made her think he was at least telling the truth about who he was. "I'll take you to him," she said. "But I'm warning you now, whatever he's done, the ranch and everything on it legally belongs to me as well, and I won't stand by while anyone tries to take it." Matthew Whitfield looked at her with an expression she would spend the next several weeks trying to decode. "I'm not here to take anything that doesn't already belong to the law, Miss Sutton." It wasn't reassurance, but it wasn't a threat either. She tied off the section of fence she'd been working on, gathered her tools, and walked him toward the main house. Gerald Sutton was on the porch when they arrived, which meant he had been awake for at least an hour and hadn't yet opened the bottle he kept in his desk drawer. Nellie noted this as a small mercy. Her father was a tall man who had once been robust, with Nellie's same dark auburn coloring and sharp blue eyes that were still sharp even when the rest of him was not. He was 61 years old, and the last few years had aged him beyond that number in ways that made Nellie's heart clench. He looked at Matthew Whitfield and went very still. The stillness told Nellie something. It was not the stillness of a man encountering a stranger. It was the stillness of a man encountering something he had been waiting for. "Deputy Marshal Whitfield," Gerald said, and his voice was carefully neutral. "Mr. Sutton, I believe you know why I'm here." "Come inside," her father said. His eyes moved to Nellie. "Bring us some coffee, would you, sweetheart?" It was a dismissal dressed as a request, and Nellie recognized it instantly. She brought the coffee, and then she lingered near the kitchen doorway, because she was not a woman who accepted dismissal easily when her own home was involved. She heard pieces of the conversation. Words like land grant and federal warrant and statute of limitations. She heard her father's voice drop low and urgent. She heard Matthew Whitfield's replies measured and careful. She did not hear enough to understand the full shape of the problem, but she heard enough to know that it was serious. When Matthew emerged from the sitting room 20 minutes later, Nellie was waiting for him in the hallway. "What does he owe?" she asked directly. Matthew paused. He had his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. "That's between the marshal's office and your father, Miss Sutton. My father has a drinking problem and a tendency to make poor decisions when he's frightened," she said. "Whatever he's done, I need to understand it so I can help him navigate it. I'm the one who actually runs this ranch." Matthew looked at her for a long moment. She got the impression he was making a calculation, weighing something. "The land this ranch sits on," he said finally, "was part of a federal territory before the Kansas statehood was finalized. There's a question about whether the original deed your father holds is legitimate or whether it was obtained through means that were not entirely above board. That's all I can tell you right now." "That's not very much." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He settled his hat back on his head, which she had come to understand over the following weeks was a gesture he made when he was ending a conversation he didn't particularly want to end. "I'll be in Dusty Creek for a while. I expect I'll be back." "I expect you will," she said. He was. He came back 3 days later and then again 3 days after that. Each visit was ostensibly to speak with Gerald Sutton about the land question, but Gerald's habit of retreating to the porch with his bottle by mid-afternoon meant that a substantial portion of each visit was spent in conversation with Nellie instead. At first, she resented it. Then she found herself looking forward to it in a way that made her vaguely suspicious of herself. Matthew Whitfield was not an easy man to know. He was careful with his words in a way that suggested he had learned through experience that words could cause significant damage if deployed without care. He asked more questions than he answered, which would have been irritating except that the questions were always intelligent ones, and he listened to the answers with the kind of genuine attention that had become almost startlingly rare in Nellie's experience. He told her he was from Missouri originally, that he'd gone west at 19, that he'd worked cattle drives for 3 years before drifting into law enforcement, that he'd been a deputy marshal for 4 years. He did not tell her why he'd left cattle work, or what had happened in those years before he became a lawman, or whether there was anyone waiting for him back in Wichita. She told herself she wasn't curious about that last part. She was extremely curious about that last part. The fourth visit, he arrived in the late afternoon and found Gerald already incapacitated, and found Nellie in the barn, arguing with a ranch hand named Corbett who was trying to underpay himself in the ledger, apparently counting on the fact that Nellie was a woman and would not check his arithmetic. She had caught the discrepancy and was making her displeasure known in clear and specific terms when Matthew appeared in the barn doorway. He took in the situation, said nothing, and leaned against the door frame while she finished. Corbett left looking thoroughly chastened. "You're good at that," Matthew said, "at being right about arithmetic, at not being afraid of the confrontation." Nellie looked at him. "You make it sound like that's unusual." "In my experience," he said, "most people will go a long way to avoid a confrontation even when they know they're right. You didn't hesitate." "Hesitation costs money," she said, which made him smile, really smile, not the careful, controlled expression she was used to seeing on him, but something genuine and warm that rearranged his face entirely and did something completely unexpected to her pulse. She turned back to the ledger so he wouldn't see her reaction. He stayed for supper that night. Gerald was sober enough by then to sit at the table, and the three of them ate Nellie's beef stew while the evening cooled around them, and the conversation was easy in a way that surprised her. Her father, when he was not drinking, was a charming man, funny and sharp, and she could see in those moments the man he had been before grief got hold of him and refused to let go. Matthew drew him out with questions about the early days of the ranch, about the drives he'd done before settling in Caldwell County, and Gerald talked with an animation that made Nellie's chest ache, because she so rarely saw it anymore. After Gerald went to bed, Nellie and Matthew sat on the porch while the Kansas night spread itself out around them in all its enormous star-filled silence. The heat had finally broken 2 days ago, and the air smelled of damp earth and approaching autumn. "He loves this land," Matthew said. "More than anything," Nellie agreed. "More than his health, more than his sleep, arguably more than anything else he should probably love more." She paused. "Is he going to lose it?" Matthew was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what the investigation turns up. What are you looking for? Evidence that the original deed was purchased legitimately. If your grandfather paid the proper price to the proper authority, then the deed holds regardless of the territory question. If he didn't, he let that trail off. What happens if the deed doesn't hold? The land reverts to federal jurisdiction. Settlers who can demonstrate continuous good faith occupation can sometimes purchase their parcel at current market rates. It's not automatic, but it's possible." Nellie processed this. "So we need to prove the original purchase was legitimate." "The paperwork would help. Do you know what happened to your grandfather's land documents?" "There's a strong box," she said, "in my father's study. He hasn't opened it in years. I'm not entirely sure he knows where the key is. It might be worth looking. I'll look tomorrow." She found the key the following morning in a tin box at the back of her father's closet, wrapped in a handkerchief that still faintly smelled of her mother's lavender water, which made her throat tight in a way she refused to indulge. The strongbox was under the desk, heavy and dusty. She brought it to the kitchen table and opened it. Inside were deeds, letters, a surveyor's map from 1861, and at the very bottom, a receipt of land purchase bearing a federal land office seal and the signature of a territorial commissioner. It looked legitimate. It looked very legitimate. Nellie sat with it in her hands and felt something that might have been relief, except that it was too complicated for simple relief. Because if the deed was clearly good, why was Matthew Whitfield still here? She didn't ask him that question when he came the following day, and she laid the documents out on the kitchen table for him to examine. She watched his face as he went through them carefully, and she watched his expression shift through something, not surprise exactly, more like a man confirming something he had suspected. He made careful notes in his book. He asked precise questions about dates and signatures. He was professional and thorough and gave away nothing. But afterward, when the documents were put back and the official business was concluded, he didn't leave right away. He asked whether she needed help with the fence on the east pasture, which she had mentioned needing to finish. She said the ranch hands could manage it. He pointed out that 2 of them were currently driving cattle to the sale barn in Wichita and would not be back until Thursday, and that the 3rd, meaning Corbett, was probably not her most trusted employee at the moment. She acknowledged that this was accurate. They spent the afternoon fixing fence in companionable silence, and somewhere in that afternoon, something shifted between them. Nothing was said. Nothing dramatic occurred. It was simply that the specific quality of the silence changed, became something warmer and more deliberate, like a thing 2 people were both aware of, and neither was yet willing to name. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and not always with official business as the stated reason. Sometimes he brought news from town. Once he brought a book he had thought she might enjoy, a novel by Mary Halleck Foote that he had found at the general store, which told her he had been paying attention to the conversation 2 weeks ago, when she had mentioned missing the reading she used to do before her days got so long. She held the book and looked at it for a moment before she looked at him, and something in her chest quietly, irrevocably rearranged itself. "Thank you," she said. "It's nothing." "It isn't nothing," she said. "You remembered." He held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and then he nodded just once and went to find Gerald to discuss some technical point about the survey map. But his ears, she noticed, were very slightly red as he turned away. Nellie Sutton, who had told herself firmly and repeatedly that she was not the kind of woman who lost her head over a man, found herself losing her head in the quietest and most thorough way imaginable. The trouble began with a man named Cal Rourke. Cal Rourke was the owner of the bank in Dusty Creek, a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with a politician's smile and a lawyer's eyes, and he had been interested in the Sutton land for years. Nellie knew this because he had made an offer to her father 3 years ago that Gerald had declined, and because he had made the same offer again 18 months ago with a slightly higher number, which Gerald had also declined. The 3rd offer, delivered to Nellie directly after her mother's funeral, she had declined herself, coldly and without ceremony. She had not known, until the morning she overheard Rourke speaking to one of his men outside the Dusty Creek General Store, that Cal Rourke was also connected to the investigation into the Sutton land deed. She was inside the store, waiting while the shopkeeper fetched her order from the back. The window was open. Rourke was on the boardwalk not 10 feet away, speaking in a low voice to a man named Asa Trent, who served as Rourke's general factotum and errand runner. "The federal man's been out there almost every week," Rourke was saying. "Is he getting close?" "Hard to say," Trent replied. "He's thorough, that one. But if the deed documents are in that strongbox the way we think they are, and if they're clean the way the old man always insisted they were, then there might not be anything to find." "There doesn't need to be anything to find," Rourke said, and his voice had gone flat and cold in a way that made Nellie very still. "The question is whether the marshal can be encouraged to find the right thing, or whether we need to approach the problem from another direction. Encouraging a federal marshal is a risky business. Everything worthwhile is risky business. The Sutton land is worth the risk." A pause. "What do we know about Whitfield?" Nellie's heart was hammering. "He's clean far as we can tell, out of Wichita. Good record, but—" Trent hesitated. "There's something in his past, something about why he left Missouri. I haven't been able to get the details yet, but the man who told me said there was something there worth knowing." "Find out what it is," Rourke said. "Knowledge is the most useful currency there is." Their footsteps moved away down the boardwalk. Nellie stood in the middle of the general store with her heart still hammering and her mind racing, and she made a decision. She would tell Matthew about the conversation. Whatever his past contained, whatever his reasons for being in Caldwell County, she was going to trust her instinct that he was a man of genuine integrity, and she was going to tell him that someone was trying to use him. She went to his room at the Dusty Creek Hotel that evening, which she knew was not entirely proper, but which she decided was necessary. She knocked, and he answered the door with his coat off and his collar open, clearly not expecting visitors, and for a moment the sight of him that way, unguarded and slightly startled, made her mouth go completely dry. She told him what she had heard, all of it. He listened without interrupting. He was still at first, and then she saw something cross his face, a controlled anger carefully contained. "Rourke," he said, "you knew about him. I knew he had an interest in your land. I didn't know he was trying to interfere with the investigation." His jaw was tight. "Thank you for telling me." "He said there was something in your past in Missouri," she said, because she had decided to say it directly. "Something he thought might be useful leverage. I don't know what that is, and I'm not asking you to tell me. But I wanted you to know that he's looking." Matthew was quiet for a moment. He moved to the chair by the small desk and sat down, elbows on his knees, looking at his hands. "Sit down," he said. She sat on the edge of the bed, the only other option in the small room, which she noted without commentary. "I'll tell you," he said, "because you deserve to hear it from me before Rourke decides to use it." He told her about Missouri. He told her about his younger brother, Thomas, who had been 16 when Matthew was 23, and who had gotten mixed up with a land scheme run by a man named Delaney, a fraudster who had been selling fake deeds to parcels he didn't own. Thomas had been naive and desperate, had invested everything he had, and when the scheme collapsed and Delaney was brought in on federal charges, Thomas had been implicated as one of his associates. Matthew had been working for a county sheriff's office at the time. He had tried to help his brother, had told the federal investigators everything he knew about Delaney, had cooperated fully. But Thomas had still spent a year in a federal prison before being released. "After that," Matthew said, "I couldn't stay in the county sheriff's office. It felt wrong to be enforcing laws that had put my brother in a cell for being foolish rather than criminal, so I left, went west. Eventually ended up working for the Marshal's office, where I thought I could do more good than harm." He paused. "That's the story. Not particularly flattering, but nothing criminal." "It is not unflattering at all," Nellie said. Her voice came out softer than she intended. "You tried to protect your brother. That's not something to be ashamed of." He looked at her. In the lamplight of the small hotel room, his gray eyes were very dark. "There's more," he said. "The land investigation I'm running here in Caldwell County, the reason the Marshal's office sent me specifically, it's because the fraudster your father's deed is supposedly connected to had ties to Delaney." Nellie felt something tighten in her chest. "What do you mean?" "The man who supposedly sold questionable deeds in this area in the early 1860s, a man named Harlan Croft, he was connected to Delaney. They were associates. The same network." He met her eyes. "My superior sent me here partly because I know the pattern. I know how these schemes work. And you think my grandfather was part of it." "I think your grandfather may have been another victim of it," Matthew said carefully. "I think he may have purchased a deed in good faith from someone who was running a fraudulent land office operation. The question is whether the federal land receipt in that strongbox is genuine, or whether it's a forgery that Croft provided to buyers to make the transaction appear legitimate." Nellie processed this. "How do you determine that?" "The receipt needs to go to the federal land office in Topeka to be authenticated. I've already sent a copy. I'm waiting on their response. And if it's a forgery, then your father's claim to the land is technically invalid, but given that your grandfather was defrauded, there are remedies. It's complicated, but it's not hopeless." He paused. "I want you to know that I am doing everything in my power to find an outcome that is fair." She believed him. She believed him completely and without reservation, and she recognized in that belief a degree of trust she had not given to anyone in a very long time. "Rourke," she said, "if the deed is found invalid, what happens?" "The land would go through a process of sale at federal rates. Anyone can bid, including the current occupants. And Rourke has more money than my father." "Yes," Matthew said, "he does." The silence between them was heavy with the weight of what he wasn't saying, which was that Rourke had a strong incentive to see the investigation conclude in the worst possible way for the Suttons, and that his ability to purchase the land would be greatly enhanced if Gerald Sutton were also in some kind of legal trouble of his own. "He's going to try to find something on my father," Nellie said. "If he can't manipulate the investigation directly, he'll try to give my father a reason to sell quickly for whatever price Rourke offers. That would be my guess." She stood up. "Then I need to go home and have a conversation with my father about what he might have done that someone could use against him." Matthew stood too. He was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the small room's lamplight. "Nellie," his voice was low and careful. "Be careful." She looked up at him. "Is that official advice from a federal officer?" "No," he said. "That's personal." The word landed between them, and neither of them moved. And for a moment the whole world contracted to this small room and the specific gravity of the two people standing in it. Close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, and the way his expression was doing something careful and controlled, and losing the battle against something considerably less controlled. She reached up and touched his jaw with her fingertips, a brief and deliberate and completely unplanned contact, and felt him go very still. "I'll be careful," she said softly, and then she stepped back and left the room before either of them could do anything they would need to spend time thinking about afterward. She spent the whole walk home thinking about it anyway. The conversation with her father was not easy. Gerald Sutton was sober that evening, which helped, and he was genuinely frightened, which also helped in its way, because fear made him honest in a way that comfort did not. He admitted that in the early days after he had inherited the ranch from his father, he had been approached by Rourke, who had been much younger then but already acquisitive, and that Rourke had offered to clear up what he described as some minor irregularities in the land paperwork for a fee. Gerald, 23 and new to ownership and nervous about his claim, had paid the fee. "What exactly did he do?" Nellie asked carefully. "I don't know entirely," Gerald admitted. "He said he had connections at the county level who could ensure the paperwork was in order. I never saw what he actually did. I just know that after I paid him, I never heard anything more about the deed question for 30 years. Until now. Until now." He looked old and tired and ashamed. "I don't know if what he did helped or hurt, Nellie. I don't know if he actually fixed something legitimate or whether he made things worse." Nellie sat with this for a long moment. What she was understanding, slowly, and with the sick feeling of things clicking into place, was that Rourke had potentially created the very problem he was now trying to exploit. He had inserted himself into the deed question 30 years ago, taken money from a young man who was scared, done something of uncertain legality, and now, 3 decades later, was using the question he might have caused to try to take the land he had always wanted. She went back to Matthew the following morning. He listened to what she had learned with the concentrated stillness of a man who is reorganizing everything he thinks he knows about a situation. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "This changes things," he said. "It means Rourke is more than an interested buyer. He may be directly implicated in the original question about the deed." "It means he had motive to ensure the deed remained questionable," Matthew said. "And it means the Federal Land Office's authentication of that receipt becomes even more important." He stood, moved to the window of the hotel room where he was making his notes at the desk, and looked out at the main street of Dusty Creek with something hard and focused in his expression. "I need to send another wire to the Marshal's office in Wichita. If Rourke has been involved in land manipulation, this may be larger than a single county matter. Be careful about using the telegraph office here," Nellie said. "Rourke's son is the telegraph operator." Matthew turned and looked at her. A slow, appreciative look. "How do you know all of these things?" "I grew up in this town," she said. "I've been watching these people my whole life." He almost smiled. It was the almost that she was beginning to love the most, the way it was always right there, controlled and then not controlled, like something that couldn't quite be kept in. "I'll ride to the next town for the wire," he said. "Ellsworth, that's 40 miles. I know where Ellsworth is." "I know you do." He looked at her again with that particular directness that undid her. "When I get back, I'd like to take you to supper at the hotel dining room. If you're willing. She looked at him steadily. Is that personal or professional? Entirely personal, he said. Then yes, she said. I'm willing. He rode to Ellsworth and came back 2 days later with a response from the Marshal's office and a response from the Federal Land Office in Topeka. Both were significant. The Marshal's office had confirmed that Rourke's name appeared in historical records connected to a county land commissioner who had been investigated in 1868 but never charged. The Topeka office had confirmed that the land receipt in the Sutton strongbox was genuine. It bore an authentic seal and a verifiable signature. The land had been purchased legitimately. Nellie read the authentication letter 3 times, standing at the kitchen table with morning light coming through the window, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for months. It's clean, she said. The deed is clean, Matthew confirmed. Your grandfather paid legitimate money to a legitimate federal land commissioner. Whatever Croft's connection to Delaney was, your grandfather was not part of it. And the $30 my father paid Rourke 30 years ago. That's a separate and considerably more interesting matter, Matthew said. What Rourke did with that money and what he represented himself as doing constitutes fraud. At minimum. What happens now? I file my report. I recommend closure of the Sutton land investigation with a finding of legitimate title, and I open a separate inquiry into Rourke's activities. He paused. That second part could take time. He has connections, and men with connections know how to slow things down. Nellie looked at him. Will you be here for that, the second investigation? He held her gaze. If the Marshal's office assigns me here, yes. If they don't. He paused, and something complicated moved through his expression. I would find a reason. Supper at the hotel dining room was not at all what Nellie had expected. She had expected something careful and slightly formal, 2 people feeling their way through the new territory of what they were to each other. Instead, it was easy in a way that almost surprised her. Easy the way things are when you have already spent weeks learning someone in the particular intimacy of daily work and conversation, so that by the time the formal occasion arrives, the formality is almost the only new thing. Matthew wore a clean coat and had clearly made an effort that she found utterly endearing, and he pulled out her chair with a quiet courtliness that told her he had been raised by someone who cared about such things. They ate roasted chicken and talked about Missouri and Kansas and the difference between the two, about the book he had given her which she had finished and which she had thoughts about the cattle market and the drought and what next spring might bring. And then, over coffee, he said, "Tell me about your mother." Nobody asked about her mother. Everyone in Dusty Creek had known Clara Sutton, which meant everyone believed they already knew everything worth knowing about her, which meant nobody thought to ask Nellie what it had been like to lose her. The question, coming from Matthew, went straight to the center of her with the precision of an arrow finding its mark. She talked about her mother for 40 minutes. She talked about her laugh and her stubbornness, and her insistence on reading every newspaper she could get her hands on, and her extraordinary talent for practical problem solving, and the way she had loved the Kansas land with something that was almost religious. She talked about the 2 years since, the way the ranch felt different without her, the way Gerald had come undone and Nellie had put herself together more tightly to compensate, because someone had to. When she finished, there were tears on her face that she had not entirely expected, and Matthew reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just quietly, just there, and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be a diminishment. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while in the warm light of the hotel dining room, while around them Dusty Creek's evening continued its usual course, and neither of them said anything about what it meant because it didn't need saying. He walked her home that night under a sky full of stars, and at the gate of the Sutton ranch, he stopped and turned toward her in the darkness. "Nellie," he said. "Matthew," she said. He kissed her, gently and carefully, and then with considerably more warmth than either gently or carefully would suggest, and she kissed him back with the kind of fervor that comes from weeks of restraint finally given permission to be something else. His hands were on her face and hers were at the front of his coat, and the Kansas night was enormous and still around them, and she thought that whatever happened next, whatever the investigation turned up or didn't turn up, whatever Rourke tried to do or failed to do, this was real. This was something she was absolutely certain was real. They said good night. She went inside and leaned against the closed door for a moment, eyes closed, with a smile she had no business wearing and absolutely no intention of suppressing. The weeks that followed were, in the private ledger of Nellie Sutton's heart, the most alive she had felt since her mother died. Matthew was still working the investigation, still meeting with her father about the official documentation, still sending reports to Wichita, but he was also, quite simply, present in her life in a way that felt like something long missing had returned. They rode out together on Sunday afternoons when his work permitted, across the dry grasslands with the late summer heat heavy around them, talking about everything and nothing in particular. He helped with the cattle when the ranch was short-handed without being asked. She helped him organize the documentation for his case report with the same easy competence she applied to everything. And he let her, which she appreciated, because some men would have found it uncomfortable to be helped by a woman. Gerald watched this development with a father's particular mixture of anxiety and hope. He was drinking less, or at least keeping the drinking to evenings, which in the context of the past 2 years represented a notable effort. He liked Matthew, Nellie could see, liked him in the uncomplicated way he had liked very few people. "He's a good man," Gerald said to her one morning, not elaborating, not needing to. "I know," she said. "You seem less tired," he said. She looked at him. "You seem more like yourself," she said, which was the most honest thing either of them said that morning, and they both sat with it in the comfortable silence of people who understand each other. But Rourke was not finished. In the 3rd week of September, while Matthew was in Wichita for 3 days meeting with his superiors about the expanded investigation into Rourke's activities, a man came to the Sutton ranch. He was thin and dusty, and said his name was Haskell. He said he had been working for Rourke as an accountant for 6 years, and that he wanted to talk to someone who was in contact with the federal marshal's office. Nellie sat him at the kitchen table and gave him coffee and listened. Haskell told her that Rourke had a ledger, a private ledger kept in the safe in his office above the bank. That ledger contained records of every payment Rourke had made and received in connection with what Haskell described as land consultations over 30 years, which was clearly a euphemism for a systematic scheme of manufacturing deed questions, and then charging frightened landowners to make those questions go away, with the questions conveniently not going all the way away, so that Rourke retained leverage indefinitely. He named 8 other families in Caldwell County who had paid Rourke similar fees to the Suttons. "Why are you telling me this?" Nellie asked. Haskell looked at his coffee cup. "Because he's about to move the ledger. Something spooked him, probably the federal inquiry. He's planning to take it out of the safe and burn it within the week. Once it's gone, there's no proof." "Why not go to the Marshal directly?" "Because the Marshal's not here," Haskell said, "and because you have reason to move fast." Nellie sat with this information. She didn't entirely trust Haskell, who could be a legitimate informant or could be someone Rourke had sent to see how much she knew and whether she would do something rash. But the information about the ledger was specific and detailed in a way that felt genuine. And if Rourke was about to destroy evidence, the timetable mattered. She thanked Haskell. She waited until he left. Then she wrote 2 letters, one to Matthew at the Marshal's office in Wichita, summarizing everything Haskell had said, and one to the county sheriff in Dusty Creek, whose name was Elias Prout, and who she did not entirely trust either, but who was at least legally empowered to act where she was not. Sheriff Prout came to the ranch the following morning looking uncomfortable. He was a middle-aged man with a careful political sense who had managed to stay in his position through 3 elections, by the simple expedient of not antagonizing anyone powerful, which meant his relationship with Rourke was the complex, undeclared alliance of men who needed each other. "Miss Sutton," he said, "what exactly are you suggesting I do?" "I'm suggesting you apply to a judge for a warrant to examine the contents of Rourke's safe before he destroys evidence relevant to a federal investigation," she said. "That's a serious accusation." "Yes," she agreed. "It is. And if it's supported by the ledger, you'll have been the county sheriff who helped crack open one of the biggest land fraud operations in Caldwell County history. And if it isn't supported, you will have done your due diligence based on a credible tip." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. She could see him doing the mathematics of his political situation. "Who's the informant?" he asked. "I'll tell you when you have the warrant." He left without committing, which she had expected. She spent the rest of the day in a controlled state of tension, doing ordinary ranch work with the focused energy of a woman who has decided what needs doing and is waiting for the moment to do it. Matthew rode back from Wichita on the fourth day, which was a day earlier than expected. He came directly to the ranch, still road-dusty, and she met him in the yard and had the satisfaction of watching his face as he saw her, because whatever he had been thinking about on that long ride back, some of it was here in this yard with her. She told him everything immediately. He listened standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, and she watched the investigator's mind in him assemble the information with rapid precision. "Haskell," he said. "I've heard that name. He's been Rourke's bookkeeper. This is credible." "I thought so." "The warrant," he said. "Has Pruitt moved?" "Not yet." Matthew looked at her. "I need to go see a federal judge, not Pruitt. Federal jurisdiction covers the fraud I'm investigating, and a federal warrant doesn't require Pruitt's cooperation." He was already moving toward the barn. "How long ago did Haskell say Rourke planned to move the ledger?" "Within the week," he said, "but that was 4 days ago." "Then we may be very close to the edge." He paused at the barn door and turned back to look at her. Something in his expression was unguarded in a way she had come to recognize as the truest version of him. "You did everything right," he said. "When I was gone, you did everything right." "Someone had to," she said, and he smiled the full smile and then went to saddle his horse. The federal warrant was obtained in Ellsworth the following morning. Matthew rode back with it and went directly to the Dusty Creek bank. Nellie was not there. She waited at the ranch, which was one of the harder things she had done, because waiting required a stillness that did not come naturally to her. She found out what had happened from Matthew when he came to the ranch that evening, his expression carrying the controlled satisfaction of a man whose worst suspicions have been thoroughly confirmed. The ledger was real. It was comprehensive. It contained 31 years of records detailing payments received from landowners throughout Caldwell County, the precise fees for making deed questions appear and then incompletely disappear, the amounts paid to county officials, 2 land commissioners, and 1 former judge to ensure the system kept running. The Sutton entry was on page 14. Gerald had paid $30 in 1852. Beside the entry in Rourke's meticulous handwriting was a notation that translated to continued leverage maintained. Rourke was arrested that afternoon. He was calm when the federal deputies came for him, which was the calm of a man who believes he has enough money and connections to make this go away. He was probably right about his connections, Matthew told her. It would be a long legal fight, but the ledger was evidence that was very difficult to argue away. "Will he face justice?" Nellie asked. "He will face the process," Matthew said, which was the honest answer a lawman gives. "The process in this case is more thorough than what he's navigated before. I believe he will." They were sitting on the porch of the Sutton Ranch in the blue October dusk, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cooling earth, and somewhere far off a coyote was calling across the dark grassland. Nellie had her knees drawn up on the wooden chair, and Matthew was beside her with his long legs stretched out and his hat tipped back, and it was the most comfortable silence she had ever sat in. "What happens to the investigation now?" she asked. "To your assignment." He was quiet for a moment. The active portion is largely concluded. I need to file final reports and remain available for the prosecution process, but the bulk of the fieldwork is done." He turned his head to look at her. "The Marshal's office will need me in Wichita eventually." "Wichita," she said. "Yes." The word lay between them, the practical weight of the world pressing itself into the warmth of the evening. "How eventual is eventually?" she asked. "That depends," he said. "On what?" He turned in his chair to face her fully. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it, all the careful control set aside. And what was underneath was something she recognized because she felt it herself, a deep and settled and entirely terrifying certainty. "It depends," he said slowly, "on whether there is sufficient reason to have a conversation with the Marshal's office about relocating the Wichita assignment, or requesting a permanent posting in Caldwell County, or various other arrangements that might serve the purposes of the office while also addressing certain circumstances that have developed here." He paused. "Or," he added more quietly, "it depends on whether a woman I know in Caldwell County might be open to a conversation about what a different kind of arrangement might look like, one that doesn't depend on where the Marshal's office sends me." Nellie looked at him. Her heart was doing something large and warm and slightly ridiculous. "Are you proposing something, Matthew Whitfield?" "I am," he said, "working up to proposing something if the woman in question would give me some indication that the general direction of the proposal is not entirely unwelcome." "The general direction," Nellie said, "is extremely welcome." He took her hand. He held it in both of his, looking at it as though it were something remarkable, and then he looked up at her with an expression that did something to her breath that she expected would require some time to recover from. "I love you," he said. "I want to be clear that this is not a consequence of the investigation or the time I've spent here. I love you because you are precisely who you are, and I cannot imagine going back to Wichita or anywhere else and not having you somewhere in the vicinity of where I am." Nellie felt the smile come up from somewhere very deep. "I love you too," she said. "I want to be equally clear that I do not love you because you resolved my father's land problem, though I appreciate that greatly. I love you because you remembered a book I mentioned wanting to read, and because you listened to me talk about my mother for 40 minutes without once trying to fix anything, and because you are the most honest person I have ever known." He pulled her toward him and kissed her, there on the porch in the October dusk, with the coyote still calling somewhere in the dark distance and the wood smoke drifting and the enormous Kansas sky full of early stars above them. And it was nothing like the first kiss at the gate, which had been wonderful and entirely better, because now they both knew exactly what they were doing and had said so. Now we arrive back at the beginning. The moment where Nellie stood in the sheriff's office with a borrowed pistol and a shattered heart. It had happened 3 days after the kiss on the porch, in the most confusing and terrible way possible. She had gone to the sheriff's office that morning to speak with Pruitt about a procedural matter relating to the ledger documentation, and she had arrived to find the door slightly open, and she had heard, before she entered, a voice she did not immediately recognize saying, "Whitfield was specifically chosen for this assignment because of his brother, because of Missouri." The Marshal's office new work scheme was connected to Delaney, and they knew Whitfield had personal history with Delaney that would make him highly motivated to find the evidence. She had stepped back from the door. Her hand had gone cold. The second voice was Pruitt's, so they used his personal grievance to drive the investigation. "More efficient than someone who doesn't care," the first voice said. "Whitfield doesn't know they told us this. As far as he knows, he was assigned because he was available and experienced." Nellie had stood outside that door for a long moment, understanding reassembling itself into a different shape. The Marshal's office had sent Matthew here not only because he knew the patterns of the Delaney scheme, but because his brother's history with Delaney gave him a personal motive that would ensure he pushed the investigation thoroughly. He had been sent here to some degree as a weapon pointed at a target, and the personal element was part of why he had been chosen. She had gone inside. Pruitt had gone pale when he saw her. The other man, a Wichita attorney she didn't know, had also gone pale. And Nellie, feeling the ground shift under everything she had understood about the past 3 months, had made the mistake of reaching the wrong conclusion before she had all the information. She had taken the pistol from the wall rack, more out of a need to feel like she had some kind of control over an uncontrolling moment than out of any genuine intent, and she had gone to the door of the office and found Matthew standing in the doorway because he had come looking for her when she hadn't arrived at the hotel where they had arranged to meet. And that is how they arrived at the moment where the story began. "Tell me the whole truth," she had said. "Right now. Before I make a decision I cannot take back." He exhaled long and slow. "What did you hear?" he asked. "I heard that you were sent here because of your brother. Because your personal history with the Delaney case would make you more motivated to pursue this investigation." "Yes," he said, "that's true. Did you know that when you came here?" "No." His voice was absolutely level. "I was told I was assigned because of my experience with Delaney-connected fraud cases. I was not told that the personal element was part of the calculation." He paused. "I found out about a month into the assignment. My supervisor mentioned it in a wire as though it were an incidental detail. I was angry about it. But by then, the investigation was real, the evidence was real, and the work was work that needed doing regardless of why I was sent." "And the feelings you developed for me," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words, "were those real, or were they convenient? Because getting close to me got you close to my father, who you needed for the investigation." Matthew stepped fully into the room. He crossed the distance between them carefully, and she did not raise the gun, which told both of them something. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her with an expression so stripped of everything but honesty that it was almost painful to look at. "I want you to think," he said quietly, "about what you actually know of me. Not what you're afraid of right now, not the worst construction that fear can put on things. What you actually know." She thought about the book he had remembered, the 40 minutes of listening, the fence line in the late August heat, the way he had held her hand in the hotel dining room, the way he had said "I love you" on the porch 3 nights ago, not as something building toward a request, but as something he had been keeping in and finally let out. Her hand lowered. "Nellie," he said, "I was sent here for reasons that included my personal history, and I should have told you that when I found out. I'm sorry I didn't, but what I feel for you is not a product of the investigation, and it never was. If I had met you anywhere else under any other circumstances, I would have found a reason to stay near you. That is the complete and entire truth." She set the pistol on the desk beside her. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she hated that, but she couldn't stop it. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "I should have. The fact that you didn't frighten me. I know, and I am sorry. I didn't tell you because I was afraid of exactly this, of you believing that everything was tainted by the mechanism that brought me here. And by not telling you, I guaranteed the thing I was trying to prevent." He moved toward her, carefully, and took her hands in his. They were steadier than hers. "I am asking you to trust what you know, not what you heard through a door." Nellie looked up at him. She thought about what she knew. She thought about 3 months of daily evidence, small and consistent and accumulating into something very large. "I do trust it," she said. "I was frightened. I'm still a little frightened." "So am I," he said. "I'm frightened of losing you over a mistake I made because I was also frightened." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and put her hand against his chest, just over his heart, which was beating quickly enough to feel through his coat. "Don't ever keep things from me again," she said. "Whatever it is, tell me." "I promise," he said, without reservation. She leaned her forehead against his chest, and he put his arms around her, and they stood like that in the quiet of the sheriff's office while the morning went on around Dusty Creek and the world continued its ordinary course. "I still love you," she said, muffled by his coat. "I still love you too," he said, with the first full exhale he seemed to have managed since he walked into that doorway. The weeks that followed were a different kind of building than what had come before. They had been through the first real test of something between them, the place where trust is either confirmed or broken, and had come out the other side with something that felt more solid for having been stressed. Matthew was honest with her in a way that was sometimes uncomfortable, telling her things about the ongoing work prosecution that were uncertain and complicated, instead of presenting only the reassuring parts. She was honest with him in return about her fears, about the days when the ranch felt overwhelming, about the grief that still came and went for her mother. This was different from the courtship weeks. This was closer to something real and lasting. Gerald Sutton, who had been watching all of this with the particular alertness of a man who has been given reason to pay attention again, had one evening when Matthew and Nellie came in from the evening ride to find him sitting at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee already made, and a look on his face that combined dignity with considerable effort. "I want to talk to you both," Gerald said. They sat. He talked about the land. He talked about what it had cost to hold it, and what it meant to him that it was now clearly and cleanly theirs. He thanked Matthew directly, with the formal gratitude of a proud man making himself say the necessary thing. Then he looked at his daughter for a long moment. "Your mother would have liked him," he said, "in case you were wondering." Nellie reached across the table and took his hand. "I know," she said. "I thought about that." Matthew was quiet, and she could see that the moment was affecting him in a way he was managing with characteristic containment, which is to say that his eyes were very bright and his jaw was very set, and he was looking at the coffee cup with unnecessary concentration. Gerald looked at him then. "What are your intentions toward my daughter?" he asked. Officially, Matthew looked up. Then he looked at Nellie, a question, and she gave him the smallest nod because they had talked about this, had talked around it, and through it on evening rides and porch evenings, and she knew what he was going to say. "I intend to ask her to marry me," Matthew said. "I have already asked her whether the idea was welcome, and she told me that it was. I'm telling you now because I believe you have the right to know what I'm intending, and because I would like your blessing if it's something you're willing to give." Gerald Sutton looked at Matthew Whitfield for a very long time. Then he nodded slowly, with the gravity of a man for whom this moment matters considerably more than he will allow himself to show. "You have it," he said. Matthew asked her properly on a Sunday afternoon in November, on the eastern pasture where they had first truly begun, the fence line mended and the grass winter gold in the thin afternoon sunlight. He did not make a speech. He had the ring that had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet that caught the light, and he held it and asked her whether she would marry him and spend her life with him, and let him be part of this land and this family that had become the center of everything he wanted. She said yes without hesitation and without tears, because she was not a woman who cried at the expected moments. She saved the tears for later privately, when she was alone with what it meant. They were married in the spring in the yard of the Sutton Ranch by the minister from Dusty Creek, who was a compact, earnest man named Reverend Hayes. Gerald stood up with them. A few of the ranch hands were there, and two women from town who were Nellie's friends from before everything got so complicated, and Matthew's brother Thomas, who had traveled from Missouri and who was a lean, quiet man with Matthew's eyes and a smile that broke your heart slightly to look at because it was so much the echo of his brother's. Thomas and Nellie had one conversation at the wedding that stayed with her. He took her hand, formal and serious, and said, "He wrote to me about you. He wrote to me before he admitted to you that he had feelings, I think. He said he had met someone who was not afraid of the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. Said it like it was the finest thing he had ever seen." Nellie looked at Matthew across the yard where he was talking to Gerald with an ease that she still found quietly moving. "He frightened me a little," she told Thomas. "When I first met him, he was so careful." "He learned to be careful," Thomas said. "After what happened with me, he felt responsible. He spent years being responsible in very controlled ways." He paused. "You loosened that, I think. He seems less careful now, in the good way." "The good way," she agreed. Matthew accepted the transfer to a permanent position in Caldwell County without apparent difficulty. which meant there had been negotiation she wasn't entirely privy to, though she suspected his record on the Rourke case had given him considerable leverage. He kept an office in Dusty Creek and covered a territory that included 3 counties, and he was gone sometimes for days at a stretch when cases required travel, which she accepted because it was who he was and what he did, and because the days he came back were very good days indeed. The Rourke prosecution wound its way through the federal courts over the following year, and in the end, Rourke was convicted on 6 counts of land fraud and 2 of bribery, and sentenced to 7 years in the federal prison in Leavenworth. The 8 other families named in the ledger received settlements from Rourke's seized assets. It was not complete justice, because complete justice was rarely available in the world, but it was the kind of justice that left a mark, that said this is not how things will work here. And Nellie watched the verdict come through the courthouse in Wichita on a February afternoon and felt something settle in her that had been restless for a very long time. Gerald Sutton stopped drinking entirely the spring after the wedding. He did it without fanfare, without announcing it, simply stopping one day and replacing the evening bottle with a different habit, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea and the newspaper, reading aloud from it to whoever happened to be nearby. Nellie noticed but did not comment, because she knew him well enough to know that drawing attention to the effort would not help the effort. She just ensured there was always good tea in the house. By the summer of 1883, Nellie was expecting their first child, and she told Matthew on a Tuesday morning in June in the kitchen of the ranch house, with the sunlight coming in strong and the smell of biscuits in the oven. She said it plainly, because she was not a woman who dressed things up when directness was available, and she watched his face do something she had never quite seen it do before, a rapid sequence of expressions, surprise and then something enormous, and then something very quiet, as though the world had just reorganized itself around a new center of gravity, and he was locating himself within the new arrangement. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then stood with his forehead against hers, not saying anything for a long moment. "A boy," he said finally. "I would like a boy." "You don't get to choose," she said. "I know," he said, "but if we're talking about wanting." "A boy would be fine," she said. "Or a girl. We'll manage either direction adequately." He laughed, which she loved because he laughed the way he did everything, fully and without reservation once the decision to do it was made. "Adequately," he repeated. "That's one way to put it." Gerald, when told, sat very still for a moment and then excused himself to the porch. Nellie gave him a few minutes and then went out and found him standing at the rail, looking out over the eastern pasture with the wind moving through the grass and his hands gripping the rail, and she stood beside him and put her hand over his. "Your mother would have been insufferable with happiness," he said, which was the most perfect thing he could have said. "She would have," Nellie agreed. "I intend to be insufferable with happiness on her behalf," he said. "I want you to know that up front." "I expected nothing less," she said. The boy came in January of 1884, in a blizzard that made the doctor's arrival to the ranch a near thing. Matthew was home, which he had made absolutely certain of in the 2 weeks preceding, refusing 2 assignments that would have taken him more than a day's ride away. He was present for the whole of it in a way that was not common among men of that time, but that Nellie had required of him without asking, simply by being clear that she wanted him there, and he had understood what she meant without elaboration. The baby was born in the early hours of a January morning, and he was healthy and loud, and had a considerable amount of dark hair and Matthew's gray eyes, which Nellie noticed immediately, and which did something entirely unreasonable to her chest. They named him James, after Matthew's father, with Gerald as his middle name, which Gerald received with a dignity that fooled nobody about how deeply it moved him. The ranch grew over the following years in the quiet way that good things grow, steadily and without drama. Gerald's health improved. He was present for James's first steps, his first words, his first terrifying attempts at climbing anything available, which turned out to be a genetic inheritance from Nellie's side of things. Matthew built onto the ranch house, a new room and a larger kitchen, and he did it himself on his days off with help from a ranch hand named Derry who had joined them the previous spring and had an aptitude for construction. Nellie watched him work, this federal marshal with his careful hands and his growing ease in the world, and felt something that she would only have been able to describe to someone who understood that love is not always an event, but often an accumulation, a building up of small things until the structure is enormous and solid, and you could not remove any piece of it without the whole being different. James was 2 and walking determinedly into every situation available to him when Nellie told Matthew she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening, on the porch, in the same way she told him anything, plainly and looking directly at him. This time he did not go still and reorganize. This time he pulled her to him immediately, and she felt him smiling against her hair, and he said, "Good," with the quiet certainty of a man who has arranged his life exactly as he wants it, and is content for it to keep being arranged that way. The second child was a girl, born in August 1886 with Nellie's auburn hair and the particular imperious expression of someone who has plans and intends to execute them. They named her Clara, for Nellie's mother, and Gerald Sutton held his granddaughter for the first time in the evening light of the ranch house and was perfectly silent for a full minute, which was the loudest he had been in years. Thomas came from Missouri when Clara was 6 months old, bringing his wife, a woman named Ruth who was clever and warm, and the ranch was full for a week in a way that Nellie had not experienced since her mother was alive, full of voices and cooking and children underfoot and laughter that bounced off the walls and settled into the rooms. Thomas had built something in Missouri, a small legal practice, and he and Matthew spent a long evening on the porch talking about law and justice and the difference between the two in a way that James, just turned 3, listened to solemnly from Matthew's knee before falling asleep there, and was carried to bed still in that posture of concentrated listening. Ruth, who was a perceptive woman, said to Nellie the evening before they left, "He talks about you differently than any man I have ever heard talk about his wife." "What do you mean?" Nellie asked. "He talks about you the way he talks about the land," Ruth said. "Like you're something he is working to deserve, not something he's already acquired." Nellie thought about this for a while. She thought about Matthew coming home from a long case with the particular look of a man who has been away from something essential and knows it. She thought about the way he listened, always that listening, as though nothing she said was incidental. She thought about the fence line in the August heat in 1882, and the book about Mary Halleck Foote, and the 40 minutes about her mother, and the porch in October with the coyote calling in the dark. "He's a good man," she said, which was what her father had said, and which seemed to be the truest and most sufficient thing. Rourke was released from Leavenworth in 1889, having served most of his sentence. He did not return to Dusty Creek. Matthew heard from a colleague in Wichita that Rourke had gone east, to Illinois, where presumably his connections still held some value. The bank was bought by a consortium of local investors, and the new management proved considerably less predatory in its relationship to the county's landowners. Matthew served as a federal deputy marshal in Caldwell County for 11 years total, through changes of administration in Wichita and changes in the territory's legal structure as Kansas continued to develop. He turned down 2 offers of promotion that would have required relocation, which his superior in Wichita accepted with the resigned respect of a man who understands he is dealing with someone who has made a choice about what matters most and will not be argued out of it. In 1893, when James was 9 and Clara was 7, and the ranch had expanded its cattle operation to the point where Gerald was actively involved in the management again, a visitor came to Dusty Creek who was not connected to law enforcement or land fraud or any of the things that had defined the previous decade. He was a writer named Harold Birch, who was traveling through Kansas collecting stories of the frontier years for a magazine in New York City. He had heard about the Rourke case in Wichita and had come to Caldwell County to find out more about it. Matthew directed him to Nellie, which she found both amusing and characteristic. She sat with Birch at the kitchen table for 2 hours on a September afternoon, while Clara played in the yard, and James helped Gerald with the cattle and Matthew was in town. And she told him the story the way she knew it, all of it, including the parts where she had been frightened, and the parts where she had made mistakes, and the part where she had picked up a pistol she had no actual intention of using because she needed to feel like she had hands on something while the world reorganized itself around her. Birch wrote very quickly in his notebook and looked up at the end with an expression of someone who has received considerably more than he expected. "And the Marshal," he said. "Your husband, how would you describe him?" Nellie looked out the kitchen window to the yard where Clara was building something elaborate out of sticks with the concentrated seriousness of someone who has plans. She thought about how to answer. "He is the most honest person I have ever known," she said finally. Which is not the same as being simple. Honest people are often more complicated, I think, because they will not use convenient simplifications. He works at knowing the right thing and then at doing it, and those are not always the same amount of work. She paused. He makes me better at being myself, not a different version of myself, just more fully the thing I already am. Birch looked at his notebook for a moment. That's a remarkable thing to be able to say about a person. Yes, she agreed. It is. The story ran in the magazine in December of 1893 under a title that Nellie thought was both accurate and slightly dramatic. Matthew read it in the parlor on a winter evening while James read something beside him and Clara had fallen asleep across Matthew's feet, which she did with the complete unself-consciousness of a 7-year-old who has made unilateral decisions about what furniture is available. Nellie watched him from across the room, watching him read, and he looked up when he felt her looking and raised an eyebrow. "You told him quite a bit," he said. "I told him the truth," she said, "which is what you would have done." He looked at the magazine for a moment. "She says here that I walked into the Sutton ranch the first morning with grief written into every line of my face." He looked up. "Is that accurate?" "Yes," she said, "it was." "What was I grieving?" "I didn't know at the time. I thought perhaps loss of some kind, a person or a place. Later I thought it might have been your brother, the years of carrying that." He was quiet. "It was," he said. "Among other things." He looked at Clara, asleep across his feet, and then at James, absorbed in his reading, and then at Nellie. "Not any more," he said. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the sofa, tucking herself against his side in the way she did in the evenings, which had become one of the fixed coordinates of her day, the morning coffee and the evening anchor, the particular quality of warmth that was specifically him. He put his arm around her, and Clara sighed in her sleep and adjusted without waking, and James turned a page. Outside, the Kansas winter was absolute and enormous, the way Kansas was in everything, expansive and uncompromising and terribly beautiful. The wind moved across the grasslands. The stars would be fierce tonight, the way they were on cold, clear nights, more stars than seemed possible over a world where real and ordinary things happened. Gerald Sutton passed away in the spring of 1895, quietly, in his own bed, with Nellie beside him and Matthew in the doorway. He had been ailing for several months, his heart showing its age, and they had known it was coming without being any more prepared for its arrival than people ever are for such things. He went gently, which Nellie was grateful for, and he went on a morning when the eastern pasture was green for the first time in the year, and the light through his bedroom window was the gold of early spring, and the last thing he said was her mother's name in a voice that was very young. She grieved properly, which she had not entirely allowed herself to do when her mother died, because at that point she had been running everything and had not had the room. This time Matthew was beside her through all of it, present in all the ways that mattered, not trying to fix the grief or shorten it, but simply being a body and a warmth, and a presence in the specific darkness of it. James, who was 11 and old enough to understand more than he let on, helped with the ranch with a seriousness that made Matthew's throat tight. Clara, who was 9, made her grandfather's favorite biscuits on the morning of the funeral with a focused precision that was entirely Clara's way of loving people. The ranch passed fully to Nellie in her father's will, as they had both always expected, and she held the deed in her hands on the evening after the funeral and thought about her grandfather purchasing this land in 1861, and her father holding it through the decades of Rourke's interference, and her own defense of it in the summer of 1882, when a federal marshal had ridden up the North Road on a black horse. She thought about all the things a piece of land can accumulate, all the living it absorbs, all the grief and love and ordinary days that settle into it like water into good soil. She put the deed in the strongbox where it had always lived and locked it and put the key in her pocket and went to find Matthew. He was on the porch. The evening was soft and the sky was moving through its colors in the methodical way of Kansas skies, which did everything at scale. He heard her come out and held out his arm without turning, and she walked into the circle of it and stood beside him looking out at the pasture. "The fence on the east side needs work," she said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Some things don't change." "No," she agreed. "Some things don't." He pulled her closer. She put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder, her wedding ring warm metal in the early evening chill. "I'm going to apply for a position at the Dusty Creek office level next year," he said. "Sheriff Pruitt's not standing for re-election, apparently. The county needs someone." She looked at him. "You would be very good at that. It would mean less travel." "I know. I'd like less travel," he said. "At this point." She looked out at the east pasture, where the evening light was turning everything amber, and the fence line stood clean and straight. 2 horses at the far end moved slowly through the grass. Somewhere inside, she could hear James and Clara having the particular kind of argument that children have when one of them has taken something belonging to the other, loud and passionate and entirely resolvable. "Matthew," she said. "Yes. I am very glad you rode up that North Road in the summer of 1882. He turned to look at her. His gray eyes in the evening light were the color of the sky when a storm has just finished, and everything is clear and washed and entirely itself. "So am I," he said, "more than I have words for." She kissed him then, there on the porch of the Sutton ranch, on the land her grandfather had purchased legitimately, and her father had held with frightened dignity, and she had defended with every tool available to her, on the land that would pass to James and perhaps to Clara and perhaps further, the land that was simply itself, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, as the Kansas sky deepened toward night above them and the first stars appeared. Inside, the argument resolved itself. Footsteps ran down the hallway. The horses in the east pasture lowered their heads to the grass. The wind moved across the county as it always had, touching everything equally, the way the West touched everything, without sentiment, without preference, with a vast and permanent impartiality that somehow made every individual thing on its surface more precious for being temporary. They stayed on the porch until the stars were fully out, and then they went inside, to the warmth and the noise and the ordinary extraordinary life they had built together in this particular corner of the world. And the door closed behind them, and the Kansas night continued as it always had, enormous and alive and full of the quiet of things that are as they should be. Matthew Whitfield was elected sheriff of Caldwell County in November of 1896, by a comfortable margin that reflected both his record as a federal officer and the particular quality of reputation that a man builds over years in a community when he is consistently honest and reliably fair. He wore the badge differently from the marshal's badge, or so Nellie thought, not with less pride but with a different weight, the weight of something chosen from among available options rather than assigned, which felt to him like a better fit. A third child came to them in 1897, a boy they named William, though he was called Will from the moment he appeared and bore an immediately visible resemblance to Gerald Sutton that made Nellie stop and breathe carefully for a moment when she first looked at him clearly. He had the auburn coloring and the sharp blue eyes, a gift from a grandfather he would never know but whose presence he would carry forward in the world. James, at 13, received his new brother with the equanimity of a boy who has learned from his father's example that the dignified response to most things is a quiet and committed engagement with whatever needs doing. He was already talking about studying law, which his Uncle Thomas encouraged enthusiastically in letters from Missouri. Clara, at 11, was primarily interested in whether the baby could be convinced to cooperate with her plans for him, which was very Clara, and the answer over the following years turned out to be yes, considerably more than most people expected. The 19th century turned into the 20th at a distance, and a pace that felt both rapid and natural. Kansas continued becoming what it was becoming. The cattle drives that had defined Nellie's childhood were giving way to something more settled, the frontier consolidating into farms and towns, and the ordinary texture of a place that has decided what it is. There were still hard years and drought years and years when the cattle market was poor and the calculations were tight. There were still moments when the sheer scale of the land felt like a challenge more than a gift. But those moments were navigated the way they had always been, with the same tools, clear eyes and steady hands, and the willingness to do what needed doing without flinching. Matthew served as sheriff of Caldwell County for 12 years, which was long enough to have known everyone in the county and to have been tested in almost every way a man in that position can be tested, and to have come through each testing with the bedrock of himself intact. He was not a perfect man, and he would have been the first to tell you so with more specificity than most people would volunteer. He made mistakes in judgment on several occasions and said so openly. He had nights when the weight of the job was considerable, and he was quiet with it in a way that Nellie recognized and did not push against, because she knew by now the difference between trouble that needed drawing out and trouble that needed sitting with in silence, and she had gotten very good at providing whichever was needed. In the evenings, on the porch, they talked the way people talk when they have been talking to each other for a long time, and have learned that conversation is not only for the transmission of information, but for the simple maintenance of closeness, the daily tending of something that requires tending. They talked about the children and the ranch and the county and the world and the books they were reading, and the things they remembered, and the things they were looking forward to. They argued occasionally with the specific ferocity of two people who are both accustomed to being right, and resolved those arguments with the specific practicality of two people who know the relationship is more important than winning. They remained, in the private language of the life they had made, entirely and permanently each other's. The last evening of their story, which is to say the evening on which this particular telling ends though the story itself continued long past it, was an evening in the summer of 1902. James was 18 and had gone to study law in Topeka, which he had done with a directness and lack of ceremony that was very him. Clara was 16 and had a horse of her own and opinions about everything, and a gift for mathematics that her mother quietly encouraged while appearing to simply provide opportunity. Will was 5 and was at the age where the world was an endless series of questions that deserved immediate answers, and he asked them with a relentless curiosity that Matthew met with patient consistency every single time, which Nellie watched and loved without saying so because some things are better witnessed than commented upon. They were all on the porch when the evening came in, the full summer evening with its long light and its warm air and the grassland moving in the last of the day's breeze. Will had fallen asleep on the wooden step, which he did with the complete physical surrender of a 5-year-old. Clara was reading. Matthew had a letter from James that he had read and reread twice, James apparently excelling at his studies in a way that made his father visibly and quietly proud. Nellie looked at her family on the porch of her family's ranch under the Kansas sky, and she felt the specific quality of fullness that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of things that matter. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked her, which he still asked her regularly because he was still genuinely curious. "I'm thinking," she said, "that there are very few things in my life that I would trade for any of the things I do not have." He reached over and took her hand, which he did as naturally and as often as he ever had. "Same," he said, which was enough. The evening deepened. The stars came out over Caldwell County, over the Sutton Ranch with its clean deed and its mended fence lines and its 3 children at various stages of becoming who they were going to be. The land breathed in the cooling air. Somewhere to the east, a coyote called, the same sound that had been in the background of so many of their most important moments, the wild ongoing voice of the country they had chosen and that had chosen them back. Matthew and Nellie Whitfield sat together on the porch in the dark, holding hands and saying nothing, which was the most complete and comfortable silence either of them had ever known, the silence of 2 people who are exactly where they mean to be, who have built the thing they meant to build, who have loved each other through the hard passages and the bright ones, and intend to go on doing so indefinitely. The wind moved through the grass. The stars held their positions. The Kansas night was enormous and full of the particular piece of things that have been resolved, not by the absence of struggle, but by the faithful work of people who refused to let the struggle be the final word. The deed was real. The land was theirs. The man beside her was real and hers, and the life they had made together was exactly as real as the work it had taken to make it. Nellie Sutton, who had become Nellie Whitfield in the yard of her own ranch on a spring morning in 1883, and who had never ceased to be entirely and completely herself in the process, rested her head against her husband's shoulder and listened to the country they loved continuing its enormous, indifferent, beautiful life around them. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.